Thank you, Chantel. We've been really pleased presenting some of the talents of our faculty in this series of 10 online workshops. And I'd like to give a shout out to my partner, Treger Otten. We've been co-producing and discovering so many things about the faculty that we didn't even know before we had these presentations. So I'm really pleased to welcome Michaela as our speaker this evening. Let me just give you a little bit of background about Michaela. She has she's worked in non-musical settings as well as in musical settings. And this has had an impact on her piano teaching. So she will be sharing ideas on how to support all students in their learning, considering, among other things, verbal, cognitive, and social emotional skills. Michaela is a native of the Bay Area, and she received a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from the esteemed Hampton University. Out in the field, she's had the opportunity to work with children of various ages and abilities in a variety of settings. And then her love of music brought her back to piano study, and she has just completed her master's degree in piano pedagogy at San Francisco State University. So Michaela's background in psychology has had a very positive impact on her teaching style, and she will share some of the ways that she has combined these two different interests within her teaching. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Michaela.
Thank you, Grace. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well. And thank you for joining this discussion on teaching and supporting the neurodiverse piano student.
All right, so should I go ahead and get started and share the presentation, Michaela?
Yes, please.
Got it.
All right, and then can we move to the next slide, please? And so before we discuss how to support the neurodiverse student, Grace, she did an amazing job giving my background, but I'll just give a little bit more information. So as Grace said, most recently I did graduate from San Francisco State University. I received a master's of music in piano performance. And so I've had the opportunity to teach piano for 8 years, and I've worked in various educational environments for 15 years. And so as a child, I began piano lessons at the age of 6, and I had the opportunity to participate in both the Piano Guild as well as a Certificate of Merit events. And as a child, the possibility of pursuing a career in music was completely foreign to me. Then and now, I am the only musician in my family. And so I never thought that I would later study, teach, and perform music in my career, which is why my interest or aspirations over the years has varied. As a teenager, I began to develop an interest in child development and psychology. I began to explore my environment, my classmates, friends, families, strangers on the street, and I became curious as to how our environment, particularly our childhood, may influence quirks, habits, and behaviors. And so as a teenager, I was able to take college courses at my local community college. And during this time, I began taking psychology and child development courses. When I was in school, I attended Hampton University in Virginia, and I decided to continue with pursuing psychology. And it was during my time at Hampton, I became involved with a lot of work with children, whether it was through an internship or volunteering. And in one of my courses, I was required to spend a minimum of 2 to 3 hours per week at a school or child development center. And my time was spent observing and interacting with students, and I would later return to my class and we would discuss our observations as a group. And so my mentorship was at a child developmental center or preschool. And it was during this time that I first encountered a toddler who displayed signs of being on the spectrum. And so at that time, not knowing anything about autism or neurodiversity, to me, the boy appeared to be really shy and maybe sort of in his own world. However, when he spoke, the little boy's speech was very clear and articulate. And actually, it seemed as if his speech skills were beyond that of the other typical children. However, the little boy would often repeat sentences and words that he would hear from others and had a difficult time with eye contact. It was then that his preschool teacher brought to my attention the possibility of echolalia. Next slide, please. So echolalia is the unsolicited repetition of vocalizations made by another person. Interestingly, repetitive speech is an extremely common part of language development and is commonly seen in young toddlers who are learning to communicate. By the age of 2, most children will start to mix in their own utterances along with repetitions of what they hear. However, by age 3, most children's echolalia will be minimal at most. And so for the case of this little boy, he was 4 years old. And despite the fact that his speech was very clear and articulate, his teacher saw some red flags due to his lack of eye contact, his difficulty in socially engaging with his peers. And often when he was asked a question, he would repeat the question back. So these were things that alerted the teacher. So unfortunately, I was only at the center for a semester, but this was my introduction to working with children and adults within the neurodiversity community. Once I returned home from school, I began working in various educational environments with children on the spectrum. I worked in one-to-one in-home settings, non-public school settings designed for children on the spectrum. I worked as a classroom aide, and I also worked at an early intervention program. And so it was in these environments that I gained an appreciation and understanding of students with amazing abilities and personalities who struggled with their differences that made navigating the world in school a bit more challenging. And as I learned more about these children, I also learned about the importance of creating an environment that was not only positive, but how making adjustments and modifications could allow room for the success and happiness of that student. And so, as I've stated before, within the neurodivergent umbrella, I've primarily worked with individuals on the autism spectrum. And so that will be the focus of today's presentation. Before we get going, I would like to preface this by saying it is important to be open and flexible as teachers. So what systems that were used for our learning or what we use for our other students might not work for others. Either way, the goal is to create both a positive and stimulating environment. I won't say that a particular method should be used because when interacting with adults and children on the spectrum, everyone is unique and there are so many nuances that adds to the personality and learning style of each person. And so I believe that any method can be used, but as teachers, we might have to consider tweaks and adjustments in order to create a conducive learning environment. And something that we'll talk about more is I also believe that it is important to celebrate a student's strengths and use that as a motivator. Next slide, please. So what does neurodivergent mean? Simply put, it means differences in mental or neurological function from what is considered typical or normal. This definition is frequently used in reference to autism spectrum disorders, as well as other diagnoses such as ADHD and dyslexia. Next slide, please. So what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity refers to the diversity of all people, but is often used in the context of autism spectrum disorder, as well as other neurological or developmental conditions. Neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. So there is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. According to Judy Singer, a sociologist who has autism, neurodiversity refers to the concept that certain developmental disorders are normal variation in the brain, and people who have these features also have certain strengths. Unfortunately, things are beginning to change. According to Nicole Baumer, who wrote an article for the Harvard Medical Journal, in talking about the neurodiversity movement, she discusses that it emerged during the 1990s with an aim to increase acceptance and inclusion of all people while embracing neurological differences. And through online platforms, more and more autistic people were able to connect and form a self-advocacy movement.
Not only that, but according to Alicia Santuzzi, a PhD professor at Northern Illinois University, who specializes in social, industrial, and organizational psychology, she believes that if the concept of neurodiversity goes mainstream, it could lead to big changes in education and workplace norms. Next slide, please. So if these changes become the norm in educational and workplace environments, it can allow room for innovation in a variety of sectors. If everyone thinks the same, how does this lead to progression or growth? The idea of having neurodivergent and neurotypical people working together could possibly create something amazing, as there is a diversity in thought as well as action. And so the benefits of all children learning an instrument are boundless. Next slide, please. And so I think about the Suzuki method. And to be clear, I do not use the Suzuki method, nor am I a Suzuki trained teacher. I learned more about the Suzuki method while taking a piano pedagogy course at SF State. And I love the central belief of the Suzuki method because it was based on Shinichi Suzuki's language acquisition theory, which is that all people can and will learn from their environment. The essential components of this method came from the desire to create the right environment for learning music. And language acquisition is the process by which humans acquire the capacity to perceive and comprehend languages. In other words, gain the ability to be aware of language and to understand, as well as produce and use words and sentences in order to communicate. And for Suzuki, he noticed that children picked up their native languages very quickly, whereas adults considered dialects to learn. However, with the children, these languages are spoken with ease at the age of 5 or 6 years old. He reasoned that if children have the skill to acquire their native language, they have the necessary ability to become proficient on a musical instrument. So therefore, no child or adult should ever be excluded from learning about music or an instrument. Also, I believe that as teachers, we should never assume what a child or student is able to learn or not to learn. And I say that not to diminish our roles as teachers, but to speak to the possibilities of the brain and body when someone is allowed to learn in a positive and engaging environment. And in my time of working with children on the spectrum, I saw children grow and develop in ways that myself and fellow colleagues never thought would be possible. However, as teachers, our job was just to remain positive and consistent while working on various skills. And out of nowhere, the children would begin to progress and grow in various ways. Next slide, please. So behavioral factors. So both neurodivergent and neurotypical students can display negative behaviors for a variety of reasons. Although our goal is to create a positive environment, we are not psychologists or psychiatrists, behavioral therapists. And I'm sure that everyone knows that it is not our job to address or sit through behaviors that includes ongoing tantrums, physical aggression, and or inappropriate bullying or language. With that, as music teachers, we're probably more likely to encounter a student who doesn't struggle with these specific behavior problems. And I say that because a lot of times parents or guardians may not feel comfortable with having their child in that environment because they might feel self-conscious. With that, more than likely as piano teachers, we might not be informed of a student diagnosis. And that's why in this presentation, I just want to talk a little bit more about the criteria to autism, as well as how we can go about teaching our lessons so that when we do encounter this at teachers, we know what signs to look for and we know how to create a conducive environment for the student. Something else to consider when working with a student on the spectrum is sensory overload or overstimulation. To the unknown, it might look as if a child is having a meltdown or a tantrum, but in the case of a child on the spectrum, they might be experiencing sensory overload. Next slide, please. Sensory overload is when one or more of the body's senses is overstimulated to a point where a person is unable to cope. This is a term commonly associated with autism, but can also be applied to anxiety disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. People on the spectrum can be sensitive to their environments, and have unusually delicate sensory systems, which can allow their senses, so sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, to become easily overloaded. For the neurotypical, we are able to filter and move through our environment while experiencing the various external stimuli, such as car alarms or large crowds. But for people on the spectrum, they tend to have a more difficult time. And so this can lead to behaviors that are seen as meltdowns or tantrums. So this can look like someone covering their ears, crying, irritability or anger, muscle tension, not wanting to be touched, restlessness, and so on. And overstimulation not only includes sensory overload, but also emotional and social overstimulation. So emotional stimulation, overstimulation can be brought on by things such as a scary movie, surprises, or certain emotional topics. Whereas social overstimulation can be brought on by the act of socializing. So the idea of social exchange, nonverbal communication, or hugging someone, it can be, it might be overwhelming to someone who's on the spectrum. Next slide, please. And so let's talk about something called stimming. So stimming refers to the self-stimulating behaviors. Usually this involves repetitive movements or sounds, and this is a self-regulatory action. And so as humans, we all stim. And so this could look like nail biting, twirling your hair when you feel bored, tapping a pencil. However, for children and adults on the spectrum, stimming is more pronounced because their experience of the world is often more intense due to heightened senses. So those with ASD might jump up and down, or they might flap their hands excitedly. And stimming can occur with a variety of emotions. So it can happen when someone is excited, when they're overwhelmed, when they're sad. And so again, everyone is different. So what causes overstimulation for another person on the spectrum might be completely different for another. However, modifying our environment, such as decreasing loud sounds or lowering our voices, if needed, limiting distractions in our environment could assist in reducing overstimulation or sensory overload. Lastly, this is where breaks and schedules are beneficial in the lessons. This can allow the student to recenter, redirect their thoughts or energy, and have an expectation of what is happening next. So again, for the remainder of this presentation, I will discuss the criteria for autism diagnosis, how to facilitate positive learning, and I'll give examples that have been taken from my own personal experience and the experience from another colleague of mine. Like I said, more and more music teachers that I meet who don't have any experience with working with adults or children with autism, they're encountering that in their teaching. And I'm really amazed because I actually hear a lot of positive outcomes and a lot of positive stories from other music teachers. And so that's how I wanted to sort of design this presentation, so that if this is something that shows up in our teaching, we're able to address it and handle it. Next slide. So what is autism? According to the CDC, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability caused by differences in the brain. As of now, scientists have many theories on what may cause autism, but the jury is still out on a specific cause or causes. People on the spectrum may behave, communicate, interact, and learn in ways that are different from most other people, which is what we've discussed. And often there's nothing about how they look that sets them apart from other people. The abilities of people on the spectrum can vary significantly. For example, some people on the spectrum may have advanced conversation skills, whereas others may be nonverbal. Some people on the spectrum need a lot of help in their daily lives, whereas others can work and live with little to no support. Next slide, please. So if we look at this slide, we see the current criteria for diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder according to the DSM-5. Just an overview, we have persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. And so this includes deficits in social emotional reciprocity, such as a failure of back and forth conversation, excuse me, or failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. Included in that, we have deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used in social interactions, such as lack of eye contact or lack of facial expressions. And lastly, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, such as making friends or the absence of interests in peers. So examples include difficulties in sharing in imaginative play if you have a toddler, or making friends. Next slide, please. Included in that is restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. This includes stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech such as echolalia, which we talked about earlier, or lining up toys. Also insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns such as difficulty with transitions or rigid pattern thinking patterns, I'm sorry. And so when it comes to the inflexibility to routines, that's why it's helpful to sort of have a schedule in place, because that's going to make those children or student feel a lot better. This also includes highly restricted fixated interest, as well as hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, such as indifference to pain or temperature, as well as adverse response to specific sounds or textures. So that goes along with that whole idea of overstimulation. Next slide, please. The next aspect of autism spectrum disorder that we'll discuss is fine motor and gross motor function. As of now, motor difficulty is not presented in the DSM as a criteria for autism. However, most people on the spectrum, roughly 87%, according to spectrumnews.org, have some sort of motor difficulty, ranging from an atypical gait to problems with handwriting. Despite the prevalence of motor problems, it is not considered a core trait of autism, because it also occurs within other conditions such as Down syndrome and cerebral palsy, as well as ADHD. However, in my experience, the majority of children on the spectrum deal with some type of motor difficulty. And this is why I think playing an instrument can be a positive and amazing option when developing fine motor and gross motor skills for students. Next slide, please. Okay, now that we've discussed the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, let's discuss how we can create a positive learning environment. And so important areas to consider are social, physical, and motor development, age-appropriate material, as well as lesson books and other materials. Next slide, please. So in terms of social and physical development, let's talk about eye contact. So working on eye contact can look differently from student to student. I think it's important as teachers to assess what we feel comfortable with. So some teachers may not feel comfortable with addressing these things in a student, and that is totally fine. However, if this is something that you like to address with the student, we can give sustained eye contact while the student is speaking. And so this can be seen as modeling the behavior. And so a lot of times individuals on the spectrum do not respond to normal social cues. And so we might have to exaggerate our use of eye contact. And so we can do this by taking motivating items and holding them up to the side of our faces or eyes during a social exchange. And so since the student is motivated by the item, they're likely to give you eye contact in the process of looking for their motivating item. Motivating items can include stickers, interesting pencils, their current method book. I find for all students, particularly in the Faber series, a lot of them find the illustrations very interesting for my younger students. So that is a motivating item for some students. And then also to rewarding. So remember to celebrate the small steps and small goals. Saying to a student, "Thank you for giving me eye contact," can provide help and input to the student that says, "Hey, my teacher says that I'm doing a good job when I'm doing this." Within that, it's social emotional reciprocity. So remember, lack of social emotional reciprocity can look like a one-sided conversation, or that the student is distracted. So we can, as teachers, we can discuss topics related to music, or the current piece or musical concept that they're working on. Remember, we can redirect the conversation if the student begins to withdraw into their own interests or thoughts during conversation. Not only that, we can set up conversation so that the student must ask you questions. So this can look like a conversation that is motivating or interesting to them, but the active positive interaction between you and the student could be a really good goal for them. And so remember, these are not things that would take over a lesson or dismiss what we're teaching or what we're doing as teachers, but instead it can be incorporated naturally into your lesson. So what I've discussed are interactions that we tend to have with students or others on a day-to-day basis. However, we can incorporate that same natural interaction with our students without taking up lesson time or diverting from the goal of learning music. And then we also have physical and motor development. So I can't say enough, playing an instrument can be a wonderful way for students, particularly those on the spectrum, to continue developing and addressing fine and gross motor skills, particularly fine motor skills. Fine motor skills are the skills needed to accomplish everyday things such as buttoning a coat, holding a pencil, typing. And so for many of us, we might overlook our ability to carry out these movements with ease, but for others, there might be challenges. So as piano teachers, this is where our knowledge of technique, scales, and literature come to play. So you can consider your Hanon, Czerny, scales, and these are all things that can play a huge role in the continued development of fine motor skills. And so, of course, we wouldn't start assigning Cheerney exercises right away with the student, but we can be sure to include age or skilled appropriate technique books in conjunction with our method books, which is probably what a lot of us are already doing. And luckily, I'm speaking as a piano teacher, technique and lesson books are often found in sets along with the theory and repertoire books. So we're able to address that with whatever lesson book material that they're working on. This can also look like for students, it can appear in how they use their body weight. So for example, not using a strong enough grip or an overly strong grip when holding a pencil. For a piano student, this could look like not pressing into the keys, which could create an unclear or inaudible sound. Also, the flip side of that is maybe the student using too much body weight or force when playing the keys. As most teachers probably know, that is something to be addressed early on, and we find that in with all students. Again, this can be addressed by using technique books or exercises. And what I also find helpful is to use hand over hand contact and physically show the student visually and through touch how their fingers are to look and what it should feel like when pressing deeply into the key bed. Please keep in mind, this could be something that any student struggles with initially. And so from there, we can assign short exercises, encourage slow practice, and repeat the exercises as much as possible, even if they've advanced to the next exercise or level. So pretty much what we already do in our lessons. And just remember, repetition is the key. And I'm pretty sure that anyone here who spent some time working on their instrument know that correct repetition is the key to skill development. Next slide, please. And now we're going to talk about age-appropriate material. So within the disability community, there are many advocates that argue that many sides of this particular topic, and age-appropriate material covers a wide range of issues such as school-related material, television shows, hobbies, toys, and etc. And some believe that others may judge, tease, and bully students who do not participate in age-appropriate interests, and they will be viewed as not competent. Some other opinions are special interests that are not appropriate, are not age appropriate, may block the development of skills connected to age appropriate interests. However, the opposing side says if students with disabilities are provided, and I'll say that again, are provided with supportive environments where they have access to age appropriate interests, yet choose interests that are not age appropriate, it is their human right. They are demonstrating choice and autonomy, and this should be respected. So instead of viewing choices as inappropriate, they can be reframed as valued, legitimate hobbies that fulfill a need. Next slide, please. And so I believe that there is validity in both sides of the argument. However, there is a difference between age appropriateness versus infantilization. Infantilization can be seen as denying access to learning opportunities based on a person's perceived ability or known disability. And so this is abusive. Likewise, using baby talk and only providing access to limited stimuli. Infantilization can occur when that individual is not seen to be capable of development or self-determination. According to inclusiveteach.com, forcing age-appropriate only interests or activities is an attempt to control and force your will and worldview on them. However, denying access to or belittling interests shames the individual. Too often, people with disabilities are viewed as a perpetual child. And so this needs to be challenged, but not at the expense of their interest. With that, it is very important to find age-appropriate material in terms of lesson books and repertoire. Fortunately, we live in a day and age with a variety of lesson book creators and writers. And so there's no reason for a 12-year-old boy to work from a method book that is designed for a child ages 4 through 7. Instead, we can use a book that is designed for the older beginner, and we can move through the book at a pace conducive to the student's learning while incorporating supplemental learning material if needed. And I'm sorry, there's a car horn honking in the background. And so now I also know that as teachers, it is our job to assign and find material that is suitable for students. However, if a student says, I would like to learn this, instead of responding with, I think that is too challenging for you, or I don't think that this is appropriate for you, we can say, how about we work on this first? This will give you the tools needed to learn what you're interested in. Next slide, please. So what books or materials are useful? Here's where I welcome suggestions from other teachers. So please feel free to put your suggestions in the chat in order to share with everyone. I have to admit that I am of the Faber generation, and Faber or Piano Adventures is something that I use quite frequently with students. Like other method series, Faber provides a wide range of beginning material made available for a diverse range of students. What I also like about Faber is that I'm able to easily adjust the speed of learning for a student that is unique to their learning style. Not only that, but in my experience working with children on the spectrum in piano lessons, I've had a lot of positive results with Faber. So how do I structure a lesson? So lesson formats can vary considerably depending upon the age, areas of strength or interest of the student, as well as the criteria factors that were discussed earlier. Either way, as teachers, we want to build those foundational skills so that our students can learn more advanced repertoire and music that interests them. And so I will now give 3 examples. And so in this, I'll present a brief description of the student and discuss how to create a positive learning environment while keeping in mind areas that we've discussed previously. And so these 3 examples, they're not exact situations, but they're influenced from situations that myself or another colleague has been in when working with a student on the spectrum. And as I said, we did have positive results. So I do want to share different things that I tried as well as the other teacher tried. Next slide, please. So example lesson ideas. So let's start with lesson format number 1. So first we have a 7-year-old girl who loves to sing and she loves music. And so although she's a very sweet girl with a big vocabulary, she has a difficult time engaging in conversation and giving eye contact. She also can become overstimulated when overwhelmed. And so when overstimulated, this looks like increased eye movement, flapping of her arms and hands, stimming, and possibly she could shut down. So what can we do in our first lesson? So again, in my experience, the Faber method has been an awesome tool. The illustrations are engaging for all children. And again, I'm able to move as slowly as quickly for each student. So in our first lesson, I tried to make her feel comfortable. So I asked her, what songs does she like to sing? And does she feel comfortable singing any songs? And so having a student sing a song for you could be a helpful way in determining many things such as speech, memorization, as well as their sense of pitch. However, for the student, they just see it as an opportunity to showcase an activity that they enjoy. So after the student sings, as a teacher, you realize, okay, this student has a good sense of pitch. So singing can be used as a tool for motivation as well as learning. And so this could look like before the student begins learning her piano pieces, time is spent with me or the teacher accompanying on the piano, and the student and myself are singing the songs together. So I'm playing the part that she will eventually learn, and we're singing the lyrics in the music. And we can repeat this as many times as needed. And so this will allow the student to follow your fingers as you play. So she can look at your fingers to see what's going on. And also too, she's hearing and singing the piece, which will help assist and facilitate in learning when it is time for her to play and learn the piece. And not only that, she's motivated and excited by an activity that she enjoys to do. In terms of addressing social goals, again, we can bring the book or stickers up to our face and eyes when speaking to the student so that she is practicing eye contact. We can ask her thoughts about a particular piece that she's working on. Also within that, we want to take frequent breaks to avoid overstimulation. So as we're teaching the student, we want to assess whether the student is becoming overstimulated. So we want to look for signs. So these signs can include big sighs, maybe staring off into space, flapping her arms or fingers. And so when this happens, you want to take some type of break. And again, that could be time spent singing other songs that are not in the book. And as teachers, we can accompany the student. This also includes finding children books that are about music. My favorite is My Favorite Orchestra because it teaches children all about the instruments in the orchestra. And again, we can take very little time to do this. We can take maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And again, you're assessing as a teacher how the student is feeling and when they're ready to move on. A break can also look like a student getting up and walking around. Maybe they can go grab a drink of water, whatever that could assist in them recentering. And so during our lessons, her pieces and music theory exercises are broken down into small steps and they're repeated so that she can develop mastery and a level of comfort. And so depending on the piece or the particular day that she might be having, we might be able to learn an entire piece, or maybe for that day where we only focus on a line of music. However, we want to end the lesson with her having a level of comfort in what she's been working on, no matter how small or how large of an excerpt or a piece that we've been working on. Next slide, please. Now let's consider our second example. So we have a 13-year-old male who is able to engage in reciprocal conversation. However, at times he can become distracted. He has a difficult time sustaining eye contact and is very shy. He is a beginning student, but he loves looking at rock and roll videos on YouTube. And so this is very common with students this day and age. And so as far as addressing social needs, we can begin with asking the student about his experience with music. So again, we're asking him about something that makes him feel good, something that motivates him. We're getting him in a positive and good mood. So we can ask, what is your favorite rock and roll video on YouTube? Or who is your favorite musician? Early on, you might not want to address eye contact as it could decrease motivation in the student because more than likely they know what you're trying to get them to look at you. And so with that, the idea of what is age appropriate, we have to consider age appropriate interactions. I think especially for a teenage student, you want to develop a sense of trust before addressing areas such as this, and be sure to interact with them as you would any other teenager. So what would lessons look like? So we can work on method books, work on method books and learning how to read music, getting their fingers moving. And so be mindful of the progress of the student and just move accordingly. Again, we can take breaks in the lesson to discuss their favorite rock and roll song, introduce a new rock and roll song, and ask them how they felt about the different songs. We can ask them, so what did you think about the guitar in this particular song? Do you like the timing of this particular song? As the student has worked through method books and begins to develop facility and comfort on their instrument, we can begin by introducing maybe blues scales or pentatonic scales found in rock and roll and blues. And we can take maybe 5 to 7 minutes and practice jamming or improvising. The teacher can accompany while the student solos or jams using those various scales that he's worked on. From there, we can create a schedule for the lesson and use if-then statements such as, let's spend 10 minutes on sight reading, and then we can spend 5 minutes on jamming. Again, all students, particularly students who are on the spectrum, respond well to schedules. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have example 3. And so this is an 8-year-old boy with limited language, social, and vocabulary skills. He enjoys music, particularly singing, but can become easily distracted, overstimulated, and stims quite often throughout the day. So when addressing social needs, again, although this child is not a teenager, working on things such as eye contact can be difficult at first. More than likely, eye contact has been something that teachers and parents expect from him throughout the day. And to him, it might come off as demanding if you try to address eye contact. So it's really just sort of gauging the student and seeing what you can do with the student. However, once the student gains a level of comfort with you as a teacher, you can begin asking him from time to time, can you look at me? Or can I see your eyes? Um, so during the initial lesson, we can ask questions such as, what is your favorite song to sing? Because we know that he likes to sing. Or what songs do you like to sing? Again, use this to your advantage. So we're finding what makes them feel good, what makes them feel motivated, and we're using it to our advantage as teachers. And so just like student number 1, you can take time to accompany them on the piano while you and the student sing pieces from their method books. Even go for pieces in the book that the student hasn't worked on yet, but he will work on in the future. And so the benefit of this is that the student has the piece in his mind. And once he advances to this future piece, more than likely he will feel more confident and comfortable learning it on the piano because he already has the piece in his ear. Addressing physical needs. So when addressing playing, again, break things down into small steps. If necessary, break his piece down into one line at a time or one phrase at a time. And once he is successful, celebrate his accomplishment. Outside of stickers, there is also verbal praise, and verbal praise is very important. From there, repeat and work on the piece, line, or phrase for as long as necessary. When working on excerpts as a teacher, play the excerpts often because a lot of times the student might rely on their ear. And you can develop a system. You can say, okay, I'll play this excerpt 2 times and you play it 1 time. And you can alternate back and forth. And so the student is allowed to hear what it is that you're doing, and then they're able to try to mimic that back on the piano. As you move on to different pieces, maybe you can even go back to previously mastered or learned pieces and have him play sort of a concert for you in the lesson. We may or may not do this with our current students, but for children on the spectrum, sometimes it is more challenging to retain information. So constant repetition helps. Also, it could be beneficial to his confidence is if he's able to play well-known pieces with ease. And surely he'll receive positive feedback from his family. Next slide. In conclusion, a lot of times children on the spectrum have abilities that are inexplicable, such as perfect pitch, amazing recall memory, and the list is endless. And so in my eyes, as teachers, we should use that to our advantage. So continue building on those areas and use that to address areas where the student may struggle. Sometimes as teachers, we get stuck in believing that students are only allowed to learn one way, and that if they can't learn that one way, then they can't learn at all. And so this can lead to negative behavior or thoughts about music and music lessons. And so it's not to say that learning a specific way is wrong, but when it comes to students with special needs, we must allow ourselves to be more open and flexible. Lastly, encourage a healthy practice schedule at home. Of course, as teachers, we want all of our students to have a healthy and productive practice schedule. However, for students on the spectrum, a healthy practice schedule will allow them to retain information and will allow for a better flow of their future lessons. Um, okay, so what do you all think? Is there a significant difference in teaching a child on the spectrum? In my opinion, I don't think that there's a huge difference. I think if we're able to incorporate slowing down, repetition, encouragement, and creativity, this can allow for a productive environment for any student. Thank you.
Michaela, that was, exactly my thought as you were winding this up, that these sound like tips that are really very positive that we can incorporate in the lessons with almost any student. That especially ones who are showing a little lack of motivation or frustration, don't necessarily have to go to a diagnosis of any kind. And I'm wondering if you've had experience with adults on the spectrum and whether that changes your approach in any way.
Not outside of teaching piano. So I've actually, I have not interacted with an adult student on the spectrum, which is why most of my examples were really geared towards children.
Mm-hmm.
However, I feel as if with an adult, we can take that same approach. I think the main thing is just really finding what they're motivated by, what they like, and just allowing them to feel good about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've had one adult student who was on the spectrum who was quite limited in verbal communication and also was doing a lot of stimming. And it was difficult to assess what he was understanding or not understanding from explanations. And there were physical coordination issues and so on. I'm just wondering how you can work with or get past those kind of verbal limitations. What are some tools that you use with that?
Well, I think that, and so we have to keep in mind for adults, born, before, 1990, advocacy for autism and different programs that are accessible now were not accessible to them.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times they did not receive the same support that a lot of children on the spectrum today receive. Sometimes it can be a layered issue. I think in that particular case, what might be beneficial is a group class setting, not necessarily piano, but just a group class setting where they are allowed to sing, where they have access to instruments, and so the pressure is a little bit is off of that student, and they're just allowed to just sort of interact with music and the instrument, and I guess there's just not a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I would recommend for an adult or even for a child that might have a difficulty with being able to like sit down and stay engaged. And so that's why I also brought up the fact that a lot of times as piano teachers, a lot of times we might encounter students that might not have a lot of those issues. Sometimes we do, but I think what I've seen is sometimes we don't encounter that is because, people might not feel comfortable enrolling their child or a student in lessons.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I feel as if probably the best thing would be a group environment.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to take up, all the question asking here. I want to open this up for other people with questions. Looks like Sarah has one.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really excellent. I have a question. I don't know if you mentioned that because so many people who experience autism have particular interests, and they might have very specific tastes in music. I'm thinking about my own child who will be embarking upon piano lessons soon, and he would like to only play music from the Star Wars movies. How do you deal with that as a teacher? And I'm a music teacher too, so I've seen it in my own students, and there's just sometimes with people with autism have a bit more rigidity about the repertoire. How do you deal with that?
Well, is he a beginning piano student?
Yeah, he's going to be starting from scratch, but he would like to play, right out of the Star Wars movie soundtracks, play the whole orchestral score.
Yeah.
In the
And I
first
know,
lesson.
I noticed that with a lot of students. I think a lot of
Yeah,
students, they
all
come
kids,
in
right?
and kids, adults, and they come in, they're like, well, I just want to be able to do this right away. And it does take time. What I would maybe suggest, within favor, there's are different, arrangements from like pop songs or songs from different films. And I would just see what you can find. A lot of times there are easy arrangements that you can find online. I've been
Yeah.
in a situation where I did, it wasn't for Star Wars, but I had a student who wanted to learn a gospel song, and she was a beginner. And so I just kind of wrote out an arrangement for her and just tried to make it sound as sophisticated as possible. So there is that, but then also say, hey, to play the things that you really want to play and to play it at the level that you want to, you just have to learn, the fundamentals, but hopefully try to incorporate both in some way. And again, breaking things down. So maybe just, I know a lot of times that as teachers, we focus a lot on reading music. But how many times as kids did we learn Mary Had a Little Lamb because someone came and just plucked it out on the piano for us? And so that could be something as well. Maybe you can just pluck out the melody, one of the main melodies, and he can just maybe use his finger or several other fingers depending on his level of comfort. But I would definitely encourage him to try both, and to say, hey, okay, so we're going to spend X amount of minutes doing this, and then we're going to go to Star Wars. And that was something that I did a lot when I was out working in the field. It was a lot of, if we do this, then we can try this.
If then.
Yeah. Yeah, if then statements, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel the Star Wars pain. I've had about having to teach. I have a lot of students. Wonderful presentation, by the way. Thank you so much for putting this together. I think this should be a must see for faculty. I think it'd be great for all the faculty. Maybe I'm going to do a special push so that they can see it. So excellent. But that Star Wars thing has come up. I have a lot of students that are on the spectrum. I think we're all on the spectrum. That's why it's a spectrum.
Okay.
And but some that really want the Star Wars. But just like you said, Michaela, that if they could just learn the Emperor's March, just ba 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 ba. I'm singing it out of tune, but just that, they'll love it. And it's just, I mean, all students like that to be able to have. But I was also wondering about, there's just a lot of things, but just age appropriateness. We were kind of dealing with that, putting together a summer camp, and what's appropriate, and does it matter, the actual age. or how their kids are placed. And also, I was wondering about I worry sometimes about touching the kids' hands, just to touch the student. I try not to do that. And I think that's something that teachers watch out for. So I was just wondering, what do you think about what would be recommended?
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying, and the reason why I brought that up is because, like, I was in a situation where I was trying to explain to the student, you have to press more deeply into the key bed, and so the only way that I could really kind of get that point across was to just sort of reach over his hand and just press his finger all the way down. Um, but like I said, I know not everyone is comfortable with that. Um, a lot of times we can just, I'm speaking from a piano perspective, just close the lid and then just sort of demonstrate, that finger movement that you want to have. And another example that I usually use with students is I say, imagine that you're pressing your finger all the way, like pressing your finger through the keys all the way down to the ground. So imagine that that's something that you're doing, and of course they're not actually pressing their finger through the piano all the way down to the ground, but it's the idea that they're pressing deeply into the keys. So I guess I tend to try to come up with different ways to imagine it or look at how to look at it. So a lot of times, we are thinking on the spot.
Mm-hmm. I had a similar question about touch because it's a hot button issue these days, and it's also it goes to the question of overstimulation and how some students, especially on the spectrum, would respond to that. But any student can feel a little invaded. Do you ask before you do that? Do you ask if
Yes.
it's okay to touch their hand?
Yes.
Demonstrate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Michaela, this isn't a question, but I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed your the lecture today. It's really, I've been a lifelong piano lover, and I love the music, and I've taken lessons from several teachers over my lifetime, and it's always so interesting to hear another perspective from another teacher, and especially with your particular group of students, how you found ways to connect with them and support them. That's really amazing. And I really want to give you kudos for spending your life helping those children and young adults that have so many challenges in their lives. So thank you.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beautiful comment. Sarah, did you have a follow-up question? And
I was just thinking that as the parent of someone with autism and knowing a lot of people with autism, that probably most of them wouldn't want to have their eye contact challenges addressed by the piano teacher. I mean, is that something I was going to suggest maybe best to ask the parent, or if it's an adult, like, do you want me to work on that and, work on getting more eye referencing, or otherwise just leave it alone? Because I know most people who struggle with eye contact, it is such a struggle that it could just be like you were saying for teenagers, that it could create more barriers between the teacher and the student. But it sounds like you've had success working on it with younger kids. Is that right?
Well,
And I was wondering, and was that something that you kind of checked in with their caregiver or parents beforehand to see if that was something that they wanted you to address?
yeah. So that's the thing. A lot of times, in my experience, and I, my experience with teaching children, on the spectrum. A lot of times the parent doesn't disclose that with me.
Oh,
I've been
really?
I've been in one situation where a parent actually addressed that, or maybe two times with two different students where the parent did tell me ahead of times, but usually it's not something that I've been made aware of initially.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I kind of leave that up to the teacher. You know, I said it's you as teachers, as music teachers, we don't have to address that. That's not our job, and they're probably bombarded day to day with people asking them to do that.
Yeah.
However, in my experience, I'm just thinking of, you know, with students that I've had in the past, that it just helps with the communication,
Yeah.
and just helps with sort of driving the point that I'm trying to make, and helping to keep them engaged.
Mhm.
And so that is why I would say that to the students. So it's just yeah, it's just a matter of keeping the dynamic going.
Yeah, keeping the connection.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, do you find that it's more successful and beneficial with younger kids, or
Well,
that
I
than,
think
say,
I'm sorry.
teenagers?
Well, yeah, like I said, I think with a teenager, it's gonna probably be more difficult because, you know,
Mhm.
they are a teenager, and, you know, at that age, you know, if you remember when you're a teenager, you don't want an adult to, you know, remind you or tell you about certain things. And so that's why I said with the 13-year-old boy, possibly not talk about it, not address it, and even with the 8-year-old boy as well, to not discuss that. But if you see, I think, you know, each student is different. So I've had some students where I did not discuss that with them. We did not go over that, but I did also have worked with some students where they were okay and they responded well to it, and they were trying to work on it. So I think it's different from student to student. But for me, I found it to be more helpful for me as a teacher because the student was able to stay engaged.
Mhm. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, well, I just love your whole approach, that it seems to me that you're overall saying that you need to do kind of make more accommodation for individuality and just be open and accepting, and yeah,
Mhm.
accommodation. I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think with that, our time is coming to a close, and I just want to echo what the appreciation that's been expressed here, Michaela. I really love the way you gave us a context, a theoretical context, and somewhat of a framework for talking about this, as well as concrete suggestions of how to work with a student. The balance was really lovely and very helpful, I think. And um, I just want to encourage everybody to come back next week. We have another wonderful presentation. Marta Rodriguez Salazar will be talking about bridging cultures from her own perspective as a binational person. And I know that that's going to be fascinating as well. So thank you for coming this evening. Thank you for Chantel for hosting us, and Trigger for contributing to the conversation. Yeah, next week, Trigger will be our faculty host as we hear from one of the people from his cultural traditions department. And
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Grace. And let's just have a hand for Michaela, because that was a great presentation.
Yeah, really, really good. And these sessions will
Yeah.
be posted online, so you'll have a chance to revisit them. I don't have an exact time frame for that, but stay in touch with sfcmc.org and look for CMC Sessions, and you'll be able to find them. Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us this evening. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you again, Michaela.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.